Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and welcome to a pretty big video, by which I mean a fairly long video, possibly the longest tutorial I've done on the channel so far. But I wanted to do something for the new plastic Mechanicum range that we've been getting from Games Workshop. And they sent me through a few things to review. I didn't get it ready for launch, but I wanted to take my time and do hopefully what will be, if not an all-encompassing, everything you'll ever need for Mechanicum, certainly a good foundation video. And to do that, I spoke to a bunch of different Mechanicum hobbyists, collectors, players, about the things that you come up against when you're painting the army, whether that's specific things or efficient ways to get them done for army painting. And what I've hoped to do is cover all of that within this video. So I hope you enjoy. Let's paint. I thought I'd take the opportunity in this video to add a few more different things into we do normally, as I say, this comprehensive guide type thing. And so I'm going to go through some of the toolbox that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to use an airbrush for elements of this guide. You don't need an airbrush to follow it. You can just brush paint or rattle can a lot of the steps. But if you want to follow it completely, then an airbrush will be useful. I've got my little painting journal in here, so I'll be writing down all my recipes and little things to do like dilution, or what worked, or what didn't work, or what was challenging as I go along. You can use a little bit of sponge. I'm using a ripped off bit of old foam miniature carrying transport tray there. Then some old brushes and my oil kit, so oil paints to work with there. And then I'm going to need something to thin it with. Now, I use most of the time, if I'm working on personal projects, something like Sansador here, which is an odorless artist grade thinner. But for videos, I just use stuff from the DIY shop. It smells horrendous, don't use it for ages, but it does dry really quickly, so it's super useful for filming. And then I've got a nice set of brushes as well. This is our little signature set from Artis Opus. Essentially what we're looking for is a nice large brush, so like a size 4, 3 or 4, something like that, and then a detail brush. And maybe a dry brush for a few little effects towards the end. So nothing crazy, hopefully. Stuff that most of you, I think, will probably have or certainly have used before. So first up, let's address Mars, the classic red scheme that we see on a lot of the box art, and obviously what the vast majority of the Loyalist Mechanicum stuff you will see will be painted in. And with regards to sub-assemblies, I've chosen to use the Thanatar for this. I've, as I say, blue tacked on most of the panels and kind of decided when I've come to it, okay, what am I going to leave on? What am I going to take off? The panels on the legs made sense to leave separate, even for the priming steps. Again, just because it allowed me to get much easier access to that skeleton that was behind them. The first couple of colours we're going to use are Khorne Red by Citadel, and I'm just going to mix in a little bit of black. In this case, it's Game Air Black, but it really doesn't matter. Whatever black you've got is fine. It's just to darken the red down a little. Now, I'm going to go for quite a simplistic airbrush painting approach here. I'm going to do modulation on them, not using a light source, simply just modulating each panel individually. Now I'm spraying here at about 20 to 25 psi. I'm using a 0.4mm needle and nozzle, and I'm using our Harder and Steenbeck Signature Series Infinity. Now you're going to need to adjust pressure and dilution for the environment that you're spraying in, and obviously thin your paint, dilute your paint accordingly for it. I have probably done something like 3 drops of thinner to every drop of Khorne Red, something like that, because it's quite a thick paint. And what I'm going to do is highlight each panel where the center of the panel is a little bit brighter, stronger, lighter, whatever you want to call it, than the edges. So the next step over that Khorne Red mixed with black base, we're going to use Mephiston Red. So this is going to be our main red color. I've thinned this again quite a similar amount, maybe 3 drops of thinner to paint. So I'm erring on the side of more dilute than I need it. I need to be aware that when I'm spraying particularly thin paint, there's a risk that it will hit the surface and spider off. So I don't want to spray too much paint in one area. I want to spray a little bit on, let it dry, move on to the next area, and then come back to the start once it's dry and add another coat if I think it needs it. And that's exactly what I've done with that Mephiston. It's actually got 2 layers of Mephiston on here. Again, just focusing on the middle of the panels. And each time, as we get lighter with the colours, we do a slightly smaller area on them, but you can see already it starts to introduce this sort of interesting shading around the panel lines, and it's just a style that I'm particularly enjoying painting at the moment. I love modulation where we do it from a particular light source across a tank. I think that looks fantastic as well. This is just something I'm enjoying doing at the moment. So say here we're going with our second hit of the Mephiston, and then all we're going to do to highlight it is mix into that Mephiston a little bit of Evil Sun's Scarlet. And I think this is a fairly nice red we end up achieving. I tried it with just pure Evil Sun's Scarlet, and I felt it changed it too much. So all I did was, I say, mix in a little bit of the Mephiston. I don't know the exact ratio here. It's approximately 50-50, but you just adjust this to what you like the look of, or indeed what paints that you have that you enjoy using. But again, this is why a notebook is so important, that we can keep all of these mixes, these ratios, these recipes together, so that for whatever reason we come back to a project, we have to have a gap, then we can pick up and do the same. And as I say, you can't write enough information in them. Dilution, airbrush ratios, the PSI you were spraying at, all that sort of thing. Now, once we're happy with the colour, we want to give them a couple of coats of gloss varnish, and this is in preparation for the decal stage. I've used polyurethane gloss varnish by Vallejo. It's simply because I'm used to it. I buy a great big bottle of it, and then I just replace it when it runs out. I like how it works. I'm used to how it works. I diluted about 2 drops of thinner to varnish, something like that, and spraying at the normal pressure I spray at 20 to 25 psi. But you use what you are comfortable using, or indeed use a rattle can. Now, I thought I'd cover the Xana scheme. Xana is one of the sort of more famous or notorious traitor Forge Worlds. It goes on to become Xana 2. I can't remember what the name of it is. But if you'd like to see a much, much more in-depth take on this scheme, I did a House Malanax Cerastus Knight a while back when that kit came out. I really enjoyed that video. I'm really proud of it, actually. So if you want to see how I would do the full scheme, if it was for my army, that's exactly how I would do it. But I did a slightly simplified version of it here on the little Thalax. Thalax, I think, was my first ever Heresy model I bought, not including the armor stuff we got for Badab. But I've just used Flat Earth by Tamiya and then Dectan by Tamiya, and followed exactly that same idea as I did with the reds, making it lighter and brighter towards the centre of the panels, and then the usual gloss varnish before we get stuck into the decal work. Now, the last scheme I thought I'd cover is a sort of generic grey, really. Well, I suppose it isn't generic, it's slightly blue-grey, but there are certain automata that you can end up taking in a Space Marine army, or indeed a Solar Auxiliary army, if you take the right characters. And I really like the idea of them being perhaps that sort of Mechanicum standard grey, and then the shoulder pad perhaps being in your Legion colour, or your cohort colour, or whatever. So I thought, yeah, it'd be cool. And the Castellax, I felt, was the obvious mini to do this one on, because he's got these nice big chunky shoulder pads that we can ping off and paint separately. I never liked the Castellax as a miniature, just never really chimed with me, never quite got it. And that's been completely turned on its head, and I absolutely love it. Building it was a dream. I think it looks super cool. I'm now figuring out how I can get a whopping great Thalax maniple, Castellax maniple into my Solar Auxiliary. But I've started off with a mix of Corvus and Eshin, as you've seen there, and then we're moving up to Eshin. I chose this simply because I fancy doing a different grey to one I hadn't done before. The Corvus grey has actually ended up injecting quite a lot of blue into the scheme, which I don't dislike at all. I must admit, initially I thought I was going to do a much more neutral kind of grey, but that sort of almost that German grey style colour. But actually, I really like it. So I'm glad, it's one of the perks of doing these videos all the time, is you come across new recipes. Greys, honestly, I've never really come across a bad one in the airbrush, so just use the ones you like. I'm using these Citadel ones because I fancied using them. I've got my big bag of grey paints out, and all I've done is pick 3 greys, the same with the reds, the same with the greys, picked 3 of them that are quite far apart, so that each stage isn't too subtle. But often I'm using mixes of them, as you've seen, to achieve those sort of mid-tones. For the shoulder pad, I just thought I'd do Sons of Horus, because obviously Andy's got Sons of Horus, and I've just done his scheme. If you want to go and check out how he's done his Sons of Horus, there's a bunch of videos on them, and we've done at least one recipe video for every single Legion. Some of them have got multiple schemes in the Heresy playlist, so go check those out. And then it's back in with the gloss varnish to prepare us for the decal stage. One thing perhaps I would say to bear in mind at this step is perhaps go a little bit brighter or lighter with your colour at this point than you want it to be at the end. If you start too dark, we're going to add things to it which is going to change the look of it, like weathering and stuff, and it will darken it down. So if you start too dark, sometimes it can end up being a little too boring at the end. So at this stage, it's always good if it's a little bit brighter than you want it to be. And then it was just a case of doing the decals. Now, I've done a dedicated video on decals, which I'll link up in the top. But if you're ever unsure what to do with them, just follow the manufacturer's guidelines. You know, the different companies will provide you with tutorials or guidelines of how to do them, as well as so will different producers of things like decal solution. I use Microset and Microsol. That's what the video's for. But different ones may suggest different things. And do prep properly. I didn't. And I got to this stage and you can see all that horrible frosting and misting behind them. It wasn't good enough. So I had to strip the miniatures. Rather than strip them completely, I'm just using a little isopropyl alcohol here with a Q-tip and just rubbing it till it's off. And then I will just repeat the stages I did with the reds to get it back there. But that's all because I didn't do my preparation properly. I didn't put enough gloss coat on the model. You want that model really nice and glossy, so there's very little surface tension there, so that when you push the decal on there and you smooth out the air bubbles, there's nothing underneath that film to be left. And then, you know, it's just say follow the instructions. You know, don't rush because it sucks. I thought I'd leave it in. You know, it happens. And, you know, yeah, it just sucks, but there's ways around it. Now let's move on to metals. This was one of the big ones that everyone I asked about painting Mechanicum wanted to know. How can you make the skeletons of your robots, you know, your automata look cool? And I agree, it's almost the secondary color, isn't it, on a Mechanicum scheme? We've all got, I'm sure, lots of different silvers. The key here really is I want to find two that are really quite far apart. So a darker one and a lighter one. Now, generally, I like my silvers to have a little bit of brown in them. I like that colour, that hue. It just gives a nice sort of look in my mind. But it's not just about colour with metallic paint. It's also a lot to do with properties. So here, for instance, I've got a Metal Colour Series paint by Vallejo. Amazing in the airbrush, really wonderful colours, but very, very thin. So it splits out quite quickly if you're painting it with the brush. At the other end of the scale, I've got these wonderful dry brush paints by MIG. Incredible colour, but this stuff's like glitter glue. You know, it's super, super thick. So brushing it on, you often are going to leave brush marks if you're not careful. Dry brushing is fine, but just applying it normally, it's a bit too thick to be doing that with. But if we mix them together, we can take some of the properties from each, the colours from each, and end up hopefully with something we really, really like. Now, it may just be you find one out of the bottle like Iron Warriors that's perfect, and that's all you use. Generally, I try and come up with different recipes for YouTube videos just so it stays a bit fresh. So I've never done this one before, but this was Gunmetal Grey and the dark silver dry brush, whatever it's called, by MIG. And here you can see why I left off the armor panels on the legs. It's just a case of get it on. If you've got the space and you're confident, just airbrush it on. Absolutely. But there was large parts of this model I wasn't going to be able to airbrush it on. So that's why I used the brush to do it with. And not when I went back and repainted it, I airbrushed a bit and I got horrible overspray. It was a right pain in the bum. But yeah, take your time if you can. The next stage for me, really, really important, probably my favourite thing I discovered from doing this little project. I wanted to create a wash to add some colour and interest into the metal. I wasn't particularly worried about adding loads of shading and loads of depth, you know, a value contrast here. It's just much more about the colours. The fact it does sort of, you know, shade it is great. And in the end, it was incredibly simple. It was 2 contrast paints. It was Ratling Grime with a little dot of Gryphound Orange in there. I can't tell you the exact ratio, but it was not a lot of the orange. Contrast paints generally very, very saturated, very, very strong colours, so a little bit goes a long way. So I mix that in and then I let it down with loads of water, so it almost doesn't behave like a contrast anymore. And then you just take your time to apply it. Brush it over an area and try and end your brush in one of the recesses, and that way the paint will pool in that recess rather than stain the surface, unless there's an area you want it to stain. So if you look here at the bottom of his shins, as it were, I finish my brush stroke there, take my brush off, and it deposits a bit more of that wash on that area, and you get that lovely transition going down going down that shin, that piece. Once all of that was dry, I went in with a sort of a lighter silver here, quite a lot lighter than we started with. Doesn't need to be super like chrome bright, but brighter. And in this case, lead belcher was perfect for it. And here I'm going to go in and essentially highlight it. Now, I'm not going to do every single edge of the model. Absolutely don't need to. But we're sort of introducing a little bit of contrast, but also kind of battle damage, really, by doing a load of that silver. And we're going to brush it on, but we're also going to sponge it on. So we've created an interesting looking silver. Very, very few steps. What, four paints, something like that. Just thinking about it. We're not all edge highlighting, not following that classic way of doing it. We're doing it sort of our own way. And now I want to create a nice bronze brassy colour, because that's going to be another metal colour that's going to feature heavily on our Mechanicum models. Now, we've all probably got our go-to favourites. Mine is Decayed Metal by Scale 75. And the reason for that is it's metallic brown, basically, which means it's a wonderful base for me to create bronzes and coppers and brasses from. If you can't get hold of it, or you haven't got it, you can always make your own up. If you want to go and check out a video where I do exactly that, I did a Sanguinary Guard video where I used various metallic paints I did like, such as Retributor Gold, and I mix in contrast paints or inks to change the colour of it. So I still keep a lot of the properties of that metallic paint that I like, but I'm changing the colour of it by mixing those things in. On larger areas, such as, it's not really the head, but you know what I mean, that the bit that's kind of the head on these models, I didn't just want to straight brush paint it on. I decided to stipple it on, and that's because I want to try and create this look of sort of brushed metal, polished metal. I'm wanting to create texture here, not physical texture on the miniature. So I'm not using thick paint, I'm thinning it normally, but then I'm touching the excess off, as you can see, on a piece of kitchen paper, and then stippling the brush on. So yes, you create ever so slight physical texture, but that's not the goal. The texture goal is for it to look like tons of different scratches, so brushed, as I say, brushed metal. Then I mix in another brass colour I like. I've chosen Victorian Brass here. Again, this is one of my favourite combos, and I think when it comes to painting armies, having go-to recipes, having go-to combinations is really, really valuable. Even if you just stick to the same starting combo and then you tweak it depending on the project, which is exactly what I'm going to do here. I wanted to create a wash that would weather and age that bronze, but not necessarily make it look dingy and horrible. Again, I've been asked by several people, I don't want to have it really battle damaged, I don't want to really weathered, but I don't want it to look, straight out the factory. So for me, this is a really good first step I would do regardless, but perhaps the final step you might do if that was the look you're going for. So again, it's a contrast mix, this time a dot of turquoise in there rather than orange, lots of water. So hopefully this demonstrates what I was talking about. There's enough of that contrast medium still in there to allow us a little bit of extended working time, but we're always trying to pull that paint towards the recesses so it slightly tints the surface underneath and then is a lot more intense in the areas that we take our brush off the model. Then once that was dry, I went back in and just applied a little bit more of it around certain areas like the rivets where I just wanted a bit of a stronger look. So again, it's not just slopping it on, right? Once that was dry, I go back in with the brass mix and then I'm going to mix in another lighter colour again in a minute and do that. So for me, like, army painting isn't about painting badly, as it were, or quickly in a sense of rushing. It's trying to decide what is really important and then trying to figure out the most efficient way of achieving that. So we're painting these gigantic models with very, very few paints and very, very few recipes. Simple techniques, but we layer them up on top of each other and we execute them well with care. And I think for me, that means you end up achieving something you really like the look of, something you enjoy the process of, but also something that isn't taking you, forever. So the lighter colour I've used here is Moonstone Alchemy, but absolutely you could just mix a silver, into that brass colour, and you'd achieve a very similar sort of effect. Metals, just treat your metals like any other paints, mix them up, mix colours you like, and look at those different properties that you get with some metals have a huge flake in them, they look super glittery. Other metals like that dry brush one I used earlier actually dry with quite a matte finish for metals. It sounds odd, but it is definitely noticeable. So it's definitely worth picking a few up and having a little play around. And then one of the last things I did was just make sure that any pistons that were exposed, I just painted a little bit of a lighter silver. Again, if I was wanting to push this, I'd be taking that up another notch with a lighter silver. You know, I said I cover a lot of that on the night video. Okay, time for some battle damage, one of my favourite elements of the model. I tend to separate battle damage and weathering out from each other. So this for me is the battle damage. So this is like the chipping. I'm going to use a sponge and I'm going to use a brush. Nice and simple. Big old bit of sponge in some reverse grip tweezers, so I'm not having to pinch. And I'm popping this in the lightest grey that we airbrush, which was basically pure Dawnstone. It's not exact. I have some on my palette. There may be a little bit of Eshin mixed in with it. The point is that it's nice and light. And generally you can always use the colour that you do your airbrush highlight with. You can always use that as an edge highlight or a chip like I've done there, because when you apply it with a brush or the sponge, it will be more intense than it will be when you're airbrushing it on. For the Xana scheme, exactly that. So I'm going to use Deck Tan. Now I used Deck Tan and Flat Earth by Tamiya before. Tamiya doesn't brush wonderfully with a hairy brush. So I'm using Vallejo Deck Tan here. Generally, when it's colours that are for military modelling, regardless of the brand, the colours will tend to be very, very similar. That's kind of the point. People want them to be fairly accurate for whatever that means. So yeah, so you know, if you've, again, thinking about the properties of the paint that will make that step the most smooth, you know, go smoothly and be enjoyable. And then for the Mars scheme, I'm using a mix of that, as I say, the Evil Suns and the Mephiston. I don't want this chipping to be particularly in your face. Everything I'm doing in this video is what I would consider the minimum amount I would do. By all means, you know, take any step umpteen stages further, make each step more extreme, do whatever makes you happy with doing it. But hopefully what these are some nice, simple foundations to create your own schemes from. So a bunch of that sort of lighter weathering. Then we go in with the brush, we kind of connect some of the dots, and the benefit of the sponge is it simply allows us to apply a lot of random chips in a fairly controlled way. Doing it just by brush would be quite challenging on larger areas. On smaller areas, I think it's far more efficient to use a brush. But yeah, it's worth combining the two if you need to. I would say I do that the majority of the time. And then over where I have the decals, I've actually gone back to a darker colour, so I think I just use pure Khorne Red here, just to effectively chip the decal up and reveal some of that base colour. The lighter coloured red just didn't have quite such the right impact over it, so it's easier going back to that darker red to do it with. And then once we've done the light coloured chips, so essentially where the light is bouncing off the indentation that's been caused in the metal, it can be quite fun to go in and paint some more sort of corroded chips. Now this might simply be the divots that chips have caused with a bit of, you know, dirty water or whatever in them, or it could be that there's been some damage and it's causing corrosion on the surface. And so any kind of browny grey colour will work well for that. You can have all sorts of fun. You can go really rusty if you want to. There are some colours that suit, in my opinion, chipping like this better. Red is not one of them. I don't think red shows up as well for battle damage shows up as well on red. If I'm doing battle damage on red, I prefer to go for more of a grey. So here I haven't used a specific colour here. I've just done a mix of a grey and a brown from that last batch that you saw. Just because I had them out on the palette to see what colour they were like. But as you can see, it's not really jumping out when we do it on the red, but it's nice to have it there. I think if you enjoy that sense of realism or naturalism, whatever you want to call it, when we're painting it, I think it's still important to do these steps, even if they aren't the most impactful. But equally, maybe don't spend as long doing this as, say, you would on the Xana scheme, where you will get really big impact for the effort that you're going to put in. So that's our armour, nice and done. A couple of stages, nothing particularly extravagant or complicated, and we're already now on to the sort of detail stage. The servo skulls, literally last week I did a little video on painting bone, a couple of different recipes in that. Go to town. Didn't really think needed to be in this video and make it any longer than it already is. The little cog machiner or whatever it's called, I think it's called that, the little symbol. Although it is white is an odd paint to work with sometimes. You can end up getting really lumpy, and it's quite tricky to get a smooth coat with. If you use an off-white, so here I'm using pale blue grey, you might find it's all you need to do, and actually it will read as white perfectly well when people look at it. And it's easier because it's got a little bit of that grey in, or blue in this case. It's easier to get a smooth coat of it. And obviously when you get it on your model, you then have to battle damage it where you don't want it. For the faceplate on the Thalax, I had to do gloss black. This is what I did when I first got mine. I love creepy gloss black faceplates. This is just thinned down with water, polyurethane gloss. I would think I gave it 4 coats in the end. Tried to get over in as fewer strokes as possible, let it dry, do the next. Really, really liked it. And then the other metals on here, just to vary it up a bit, they've all got the decayed metal base, and then I've just chosen a different colour to put over the top of them. So just to add a little bit of variety, but not adding a huge amount of complication. And I would say the order in which I'm showing things in this video is quite important, and that's because I do the silvers before I do the battle damage, so that if I get any metal silver onto the panels and I don't want it, I can easily cover that using the chipping. And it's also why I like to battle damage my models, because it always gives me a little bit of insurance in the back pocket. For if I do make a mistake, I can just battle damage it up. Now, lenses are something else we're going to come across. I cover them in the majority of sci-fi videos I do. So really what I wanted to talk about is when I do lenses, I try and pick 3 colours that are a big step apart from each other. And the middle colour will generally be the colour of the lens, as it were. Now, you look at those 3 reds there, those are 3 of ours that are coming out in the future. There's not a big enough jump between those 3. It won't be as effective. We're working generally with lenses in such small areas, you need bigger jumps. So something like that triad will be much more effective and impactful as a lens colour. And here, although this isn't real time that I'm leaving in here, I've sped it up. I think this is 2 times speed. I just left the entire process in for how I'm doing the lenses. So I start with a darker colour. And my paint here, I'm always thinning it on my wet palette, not too much on my brush. I just start creating sort of a crescent on the bottom left. As we were looking, if these were a clock, I'm creating a crescent on the left-hand side and towards the bottom of that clock face. And that's because I'm going to create a reflection point in the top right corner. So I want the bottom left to be nice and bright with the colour, and then I might do a little white dot in the opposite corner. But what I wanted to show really by leaving it in was that when I paint anyway, I don't try and do each step in one go. I work through the colours, then I work back down, then I might add the mid-tone in to change the size of that brighter green crescent like I'm doing here. I kind of erase it a bit. I find it a nice relaxing way to work, and it means that there's never too much pressure on any of the stages to be mega accurate, because you know you can always tweak it a little bit with the next step. But yeah, it took about a minute, I think, to do, maybe 2 minutes to do these lenses. And again, that big jump between the colours just made it a lot easier to work with. See there, I've gone back in with that mid-tone again, just adjusting the size of that highlight. And a little bit of a reflection dot in that top corner. And then I think I go in and add a little bit of white to that just for a final little dot, just to make it jump out. They're not perfect by any means, but what they are is absolutely good enough for an army scheme. But this is the type of thing that if you did spend a bit more time on, again, it would really elevate those models, and you've given yourself time to do, because the rest of the stages have been so efficient. Now we're going to move on to weathering. As I say, I consider weathering different to battle damage. I think I would always weather a model regardless of whether I battle damaged or not. I think it's nice to show the sort of battlefield atmospheric effects on the miniature. And for this, I'm going to use oils. Now, you know I enjoy using oil paints. Here I'm using a Winsor & Newton Artist Oil colour. I'm thinning it down with mineral spirits. Start 50-50. You don't want too much thinner in there. Once you start adding too much thinner, some of the oil paints may break up. And when you apply them, you end up getting this weird sort of split and grainy effect. If you need to thin the oil so much for it to be more translucent, then you need to potentially look at an oil with less opacity in the paint. So have a look at it here. You can see the sort of dilution I've gone for on the sprue there. Probably a little bit thicker, a little bit more solid than your classic sort of Agrax or something like that. And then I'm just going to start working this over the model. Again, not slopping it all over and then removing loads. Just thinking about where do I want to put a bit of dirt and grime. And the colour works beautifully on the Xana scheme. Not only is it dirt and grime, but it's also, reinforcing those recesses and creating that value contrast, that shadow in the recesses. But for instance, on the red, it's going to need to be a bit darker, so I might use a different colour. So just slowly working my way around. I haven't varnished the model. You don't need to, as long as your acrylic paint is dry. Your oil paint's not going to interact with it in any way at all, nor's the White Spirit. Just make sure those layers are dry. So typically, if I'm painting myself, I will try and leave a session between finishing the acrylic paintwork and then going and doing my oils. So here, for instance, on the red, I've gone for a darker brown. I'm using Sepia here by Absalom 502, and that's just because they're that raw umber that I used on the Xana one. It looks like dirt, which is great, but it doesn't give me quite so much impact in the recesses. So I want a little bit of a darker colour to help me out there. And I'm doing all the recesses and some of the armour panels and nearly all of the metal. These oils plopped over some of the metal combined with that lovely orangey wash we did earlier. I'm over the moon with how it's come out. It's a similar thing I've done for years on my metals, but this is just a particular combination I've really enjoyed the results of. And then what I like to do as well is, again, a little bit of an orangey colour, so like a burnt sienna or dark rust here by Absalom 502. And while that other oil is wet, I'm just going in and doing the odd little dot here and there, and it just gives that little bit of rust here and there. Nothing crazy, but again, enough to make it look interesting. And doing things like this, for me, the impact you get from them is enormous compared to the actual time it takes to do. Typically the back of the miniature here, but I think the back of the miniature looks lovely, and it's all been created by layering up those simple techniques, but putting them on top of each other. You end up with something that looks, I think, quite exciting. And then a bit of verdigris, bit of corrosion, bit of oxidization, if you want to call it. It's always good. Everyone loves a gimmick. It's beautiful. I think verdigris on copper always looks fantastic. So here I'm using turquoise lights, but a turquoise oil is what I'm using on this. And if you like this, check out. I did an entire video on verdigris. Quite nerdy, different ways of doing it. Again, this is just one colour, and I think the impact is pretty huge. And now it's just time for those finishing touches, really. As I say, everything up until now has been, I feel, so efficient that you've definitely bought yourself the time to spend a session going through all the models. You get them all to this step, and then you can spend a little bit of time, just maybe a minute, 2 minutes a miniature, just adding these couple of final touches. So for me, that's going in with a really bright silver and just picking out the odd area, the odd edge that I want to catch the light. Perhaps, focus someone's view when they're looking at the miniature. Okay, I'm doing this over the oils. The oils are dry, so there's no issue. We don't need to do any varnishing or anything like that. Your acrylic paint will go over them fine as long as they're dry. I've obviously started painting the base here. That's coming up in a minute in the video, in case you're wondering. But I did it at this stage because it was efficient, because I was leaving the oils to dry. I figured I may as well leave the base to dry as well. And then over the muzzles of some of the weapons, so say the bolt cannons and the flamers in his hands here, I just want to do a little bit of scorching. So for this, I'm using Agrax Earthshade. Any brown wash will do absolutely fine. Something like a wash is going to work better than a brown paint, because we want that translucency we get with the washes. And really, really take your time with this. Spray a little bit on. It won't look like there's anything on there. Let it dry. You could use the air from the airbrush to dry it if you want as well, and then spray another coat on, build it up. I probably did close to 10 coats, I imagine, to get the kind of brown I want, but I think you get a lovely effect from it. And for the plasma, now I'm not a huge fan of glowy OSL type things on my Heresy stuff, but what I love to do is get a bit of extra colour in by just playing around with heat, discoloration and stuff. So generally on my plasma, I tend to use a purple on the nozzles rather than a brown into black. I often like to go purple, brown, black, or purple, black, like I'm doing here. So I've taken a purple wash, and again, I'm just slowly going to apply it to the ends of the weapon. It's so cool on the plastic kit as well. You can build a open, like flowered open plasma mortar. People used to do it. They used to convert the old resin one, so you could do this with it. But yeah, you just build the model like this now. The Thanatar kit's an incredible kit. It took me a best part of a day to build, I would say. But yeah, what a beautiful kit. And then I use a matte black, so I'm using old model color black here, just because I know it gives a nice matte finish. If the black you've got's quite glossy, mix a bit of matte varnish in if you've got it, that'll do, or pick up a black paint that you know gives a matte finish. And on areas like the plasma mortar, I'm just going to dry brush that on to the tips, for that sort of soot effect. And also I think this helps just reinforce the fact that that purple isn't meant to be an OSL type glow. It is meant to be discoloration. But for things like the flamers or the muzzle, nozzle, whatever it's called, end bit of the bolt cannon, we're just going to use an airbrush to spray it on. That's how I prefer to apply it, because I think you get a really lovely transition when you use the airbrush for this effect. But certain areas it's just not realistic to do that with. Certainly for army painting anyway. If it was a display model, I might. I did on my Stormblade years ago. Yeah, again, really, really simple things. Couple of steps each, if that. But for me, they're really elevating this army paint job now. And I couldn't not do a bit of blood on his big circular saw blade things. Blood for the Blood God. It's a classic. If you need a one-shot blood thing to do, I don't think there's much better out there than this product. I really like using Tamiya's and stuff like that for blood as well, but for straight out of the pot, does a great job. I think Blood for the Blood God is superb. So I just sort of blobbed it on where I wanted it, then bit of water on my brush and just kind of thin it out, feather it out onto the model where I want it to go. Absolutely love these Castellax. They're amazing. They're 100% going in the solars. So potentially conspicuous by his absence until this point, the Thrall. It's because there's not much difference with the model, actually. The most of it I painted exactly the same as everything you've seen before. But there's just a couple of bits on here that you don't find on the automata, namely his fleshy bits that are still there. I have chosen to airbrush the flesh tone over black deliberately here. I want the black underneath to desaturate it. I want him to basically have fairly necrotic, ish looking skin. And the airbrush, so I've thinned that skin colour right down, 3-4 drops of thinner to paint, really, really dilute, so that we can see the black through it and we can build it up. And then I'm going to use just a couple of gross colours, so I've got a green and a purple there. I've used contrast paints there. I really enjoy using contrast paints, you'll have noticed if you've watched many of my tutorials. But this I've thinned down with a bit of water. I'm using it much more like a wash, and just carefully controlled, applying this over to start changing the tones of that skin and just make it really, really grim. And whilst it's still a little bit wet, I'm going to use some of the purple, that purpley grey colour, and just kind of blend that in as well. Thralls, they're amazing minis. I know that they're like 2 points and useless, but they build pretty quick, and I think they paint pretty quick. This is absolutely how I would paint if I was doing this for my army. The Thrall went together in about half an hour. It was absolutely brilliant, like the paint job, just absolutely brilliant. I'm not tempted to do them, an army of them, but it was good to get an understanding of it. And then all I've done there is just mixed a bit of the contrast into the Cadian flesh tone and just brush that on, just because I like stuff to look brush painted. I don't like it to just look airbrushed. I think you get a nicer effect. Then his trousers, I've blacked everything out. Then that's probably the longest step of all, took about 5 minutes. Nice smooth black base coat, and then a simple one grey highlight on all the black fatigues. And then the rest we just paint up exactly the same as we done with the automata. We do the same chipping colours, same metal colours, same everything. The grey I've used, if anyone wants to know, is Eshin mixed in with the black to give me a colour I wanted. It's absolutely fine. We're going to put oils, we're going to put all sorts over the top of it. Does the job, gives it a bit of interest. Move on and paint the next 40 or whatever it is you've got to do with these guys. But again, that brass diving helmet type thing that they've stuck him in, it's horrendous. It's horrible what they do with these guys. Here again you can see the impact of that verdigris. really do a Mechanicum video without doing some Martian bases, could I? So a nice simple basing, army sort of basing technique. I'm using here a nice light, fairly neutral coloured basing texture, thinning it down with a load of water, because essentially it's just me doing this rather than using glue and sand. But I like working with these texture pastes. Once that's thinned down and it's still wet, it also acts as an adhesive. So I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of rubble over here. And this is natural rock. This is an old fossil from my garden that I've smashed up to get different grades and what you call it, sizes of pebbly bits. But I really like that difference in size that you get by doing it that way. But also I love those natural tones that we get from using actual rocks. But I do want to paint over them. So I've picked two colours here, a sort of pinky orange and a browny yellow, just kind of what I think are sort of Martian colours. Don't worry too much, just make it look cool, right? And I've thinned them down loads. You can see here, they're like a wash, really, tons and tons of water. And I might put a couple of coats on, but the reason I'm doing that is because I want the colours to show through from those pebbles and stuff that I've put on there. I'm sure pebbles isn't the right word, but it escapes me right now what I should be calling it. And then whilst the one colour's wet, I'm just mixing in some of the other colour as well. So we just get a bit of interest on the base. And you could just leave it at that if you wanted. But I really like that dusty look you get from pigments. And I thought it was particularly appropriate for this sort of Martian basing. Now, pigments are very, very powerful. So we need to be careful how we use them. They can obliterate an awful lot of what's underneath them if you're a bit too heavy-handed. So I'm just sprinkling on a tiny, tiny bit. And then with a very, very soft brush, I'm really working it into the surface. Now, pigments can be very fragile. They can brush off very easily if they're on a particularly smooth surface or used in a large quantity. But these are being used very sparingly, and we're really working them in. So I'm not going to worry about using a fixative to keep them on there. They're not going anywhere. If it was loose on the surface, absolutely it would. But I've really worked it in. And I'd be very confident packing this army up, gaming with it, that I wouldn't be getting loads of powder over everywhere. Again, I'm just using two colours fairly similar to what we did with the paint, and working them over the feet a little bit, as well, just to help blend that model into the base. And again, you can always go backwards and forwards. It's nice and relaxing, very, very simple, and I think incredibly effective for that kind of Martian base without being perhaps too in your face. And there we are, done. I've really enjoyed this video. I'm sorry it's took a few weeks to get out, guys. I'd have liked it ready for launch, but I didn't want to rush it. I felt it was quite an important one. I'm incredibly proud of our Heresy playlist, and it was lovely that the Mechanicum was going to get their time to shine and be part of it. I'm absolutely not saying I won't do any more Mechanicum in the future, but for now, I feel that we've at least covered a lot of those core things that we spoke about earlier in the video. And yeah, as you can see, it's simple processes, but repeated and layered on top of each other, giving you tons of depth, tons of interest, but none of them individually being particularly complicated. And I think as well for army painting, what I like is each stage isn't particularly laborious, particularly time consuming, and they do break down nicely into hobby sessions. You could do your entire army in a batch where you do each stage, on everything, and then move on. Once that step one's complete on everything, you move on to step two. But equally, if you wanted to just keep your motivation going, you could perhaps do all the airbrushing in one session and then start working on them on a unit by unit basis. That's typically how I would do it, and how I've been doing it with my Solar Auxilia. It's efficient, but it keeps me motivated because I finish models a little bit more, regularly. I'm going to have an update video soon on the Solar. I'd really like to show off where I've got to. But I appreciate that not everybody's particularly interested in that. But yeah, I'm loving them, especially now I've got to add some Mechanicum in. But yes, that's beside the point. But equally, I could go back 6 months later and add to this army because I've got it written down in my recipe book. Nothing is particularly complicated. And it's just a case of following that process, executing each step to the best of your ability, taking care, but not obsessing over it. And just balancing it out to your taste. I say, most of these stages are really variable. You can go far more extreme than I've gone, on any of them, and have it look how you want it to look. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, consider checking out our Patreon. I don't think I've mentioned it till now. We do a video over on Patreon each week, usually Andy, usually more deep dive video. He's currently working on his Golden Demon entry. We massively appreciate the support you guys give us over there. It allows myself and Andy to do this full time, to produce content here over on YouTube and over on Patreon, as well as the podcast. You get exclusive Patreon podcasts as well, and you support things like the MPO. So we've got MPO online coming up soon, and then we've got in person next year as well. And it's all thanks to the support from you guys over there. And if for any reason you can't support us there, consider, hitting that like button, subscribe, share, comment, all of that. It does make a massive difference, and I really appreciate it. I read all the comments, and if you've got any questions at all, pop them down there, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. So thanks ever so much for your support. Take care, and I'll see you next time. If you've liked any of the models in this video and you fancy having an army of them yourself, but perhaps you don't have the time or wherewithal to get it done, consider dropping us an email at commissions@cultofpaint.com, and maybe Ben can sort you out.